Can we go to that world of psychedelics for a bit?
Well, MK Ultra was a program by the CIA. What they were looking at was, can you take these drugs, these psychedelic drugs, and weaponize them in different ways, for interrogation, for truth serums, for exposing somebody before they give a big talk to something like LSD, and then they can't talk or make a fool of themselves. Or can you spray LSD over the battlefield and have everybody tripping and drop their weapons, and then you just walk up and nobody dies and you've won the battle. So
it's a fascinating concept.
Yeah, they call it non-lethal incapacitance. The irony of it is that Ken Kesey is one of the main early people that got LSD in this context, and then he was one of the main people that helped inspire the hippies to use psychedelics to oppose the Vietnam War. So I think the CIA kind of, in many cases, things get out of their control, what they think they can do, and it turned into be a disaster for them. I think there was some thought that some of the people at the CIA had, is that if you can turn people inside, take drugs and they just focus on their internal experience, they're not going to be involved politically. Mm-hmm. It's a way to sort of take people offline. And what I don't think they counted on is that when you're offline and you have these unitive spiritual experiences and you realize how we're all connected, then why do you want to go out and kill these Vietnamese and put one dictator over another dictator, dictators on both sides in North Vietnam and South Vietnam? Why are we doing that?
It's a complicated space because the psychedelics are always looked at through the lens of the 60s and people losing their mind. And there's I always say, you don't want to Ken Kesey out of the game. Ken Kesey was amazing, right? Part of the whole Beat Generation thing. And he was actually at the VA near Stanford. That's where he eventually, in Menlo Park, he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But, Huxley, Kesey, they did a lot of LSD. Yeah. And they all lost their jobs, right? They lost their jobs at big institutions like Harvard and Stanford and elsewhere, or they left because they made themselves the experiments.
Yes.
Hopkins, as far as I know, is one of the first places, if not the first place, where whatever Matt may or may not be doing in his own life, I don't know, it's really about the patients and whether or not the patients in these institutional review board approved studies, whether or not they're getting better in situations like depression. I think it's clear that there's a very close relationship between hallucinogenic states and dreaming of the sort that would describe for REM dreaming.
The experiences on these compounds can be so far out there or so deep. And and they're doing that by tinkering with the same machinery that's going on up there. I mean, my assumption, and I think it's a good assumption, is that all experiences, there's a biological side to all phenomenal experience. So there is not, the divide between biology, and experience or psychology is it's not one or the other. These are just two sides of the same coin. I think all of our experience is related to these biological events. So whether they be naturally occurring neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, et cetera, and a whole other sort of biological activity and kind of another layer up that we could talk about is network activity, communication amongst brain areas. Like, this is always going on. Even if I just prompt you to think about a loved one, like there's something happening biologically. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's always another side of the coin. So, and another way to put that is all of our subjective experience outside of drugs, it's all a controlled hallucination in a sense. Like, this is completely constructed. Our experience of reality is completely a simulation. So I think we're on solid ground to say that that's our best guess, and that's a pretty reasonable thing to say scientifically.
The psychedelics may, because they might be affecting this portal in certain ways that it turns it around and opens up. In other words, it maybe once we understand what this thing is a portal, your body is a portal, and understand all of its complexities, maybe we'll realize that portal can be shifted and to different parts of the deeper consciousness, mm-hmm. and give new windows on it. And so in that way, maybe, yes, psychedelics could open up new portals in the sense that they're taking something that's already a complex portal and just tweaking it a bit.
For instance, when you are young, you have seen things from certain perspectives, but not from others.
Yeah.
So your brain is generating new perspectives of objects that you already know, which means they can learn to recognize them later from different perspectives. And I suspect that's the reason why many of us remember to have flying dreams as children, because it's just different perspectives of the world that we already know. And that it starts to generate these different perspective changes, and then it fluidly turns this into a flying dream to make sense of what's happening, right? So you fill in the gaps, and suddenly you see yourself flying. And similar things can happen with semantic relationships. So it's not just spatial relationships, but it can also be the relationships between ideas that are being changed. And it seems that the mechanisms that make that happen during dreaming are interacting with these same receptors that are being stimulated by psychedelics. So I suspect that there is a thing that I haven't read really about. The way in which dreams are induced in the brain is not just that the activity of the brain gets tuned down because you are somehow your eyes are closed and you no longer get enough data from your eyes, but there is a particular type of neurotransmitter that is saturating your brain during these phases, during the REM phases, and you produce controlled hallucinations. And psychedelics are linking into these mechanisms, I suspect.
It's become more acceptable in the scientific community to do large-scale studies of psychedelics, for example. And there's a lot of connection between psychedelics and dreams. There's very similar states. There's a lot our mind does when it detaches itself from reality, that it can just explore a lot of different ideas. It's very possible that dreams is you're traveling somewhere. And the same thing with psychedelics, you're traveling somewhere.
I agree.
In a different, not traveling through physical space, it's the other dimensions that we're talking about. You're traveling through some other dimension to meet some other creature.
I think that story took off a little too soon, although,
Yes.
So I think in the story that the DMN, the default mode network, relating to the self, and I know some neuroscientists, it drives them crazy if you say that it's the ego, it's like, but self-referential processing, if you go that far, like that was already known before psychedelics. Psychedelics didn't really contribute to that. The idea that this type of brain network activity was related to a sense of self. But it is absolutely striking that psychedelics that people report with pretty high reliability, these unity experiences that where people subjectively like they report losing, or again, like the boundaries of however you want to say it, like these unity experiences. I think we can do a lot with that in terms of figuring out the nature of the sense of self.
Well, Aldous Huxley talked about the brain as a reducing valve, that we have an enormous amount of information. So right now there's an air conditioning sound in the background, but that's not crucial to what you and I are doing, talking to each other. So we kind of tune that out. You know, there's all sorts of sights and sounds. There's incoming information in all the different sense modalities. And we have to figure out what's important to us. And so the mind, in a way, focuses a lot on what are our core needs. And we filter all the incoming information that we get towards focusing on what our core needs. And we can even get to Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs about survival needs, belonging needs, esteem needs, you go on. So I think what I mean by bringing things to the surface is that we tend to not focus on a lot of things that are coming, but we also push away things that are difficult emotionally, difficult cognitively. You know, we all know that we're on this very short trajectory from birth to death, but we're not constantly thinking about dying. Although that can actually be helpful to focus us on what's really important. Traumas are often suppressed. Conflicts. We see in America and around the world a kind of rise of irrationality, where people push away their logic in order for their emotional tribal needs to be met. A lot of people are suffering from early childhood traumas of a different kinds, or abandonment issues, or anything. So we tend to focus on just, what we need to survive and what we need for work and esteem. And so psychedelics, by dissolving this ego control, or by, with MDMA, kind of strengthening our sense of self and our sense of self-acceptance, we can bring in other information that have previously been too complicated or too painful.
People want to suggest, and Terence McKenna certainly did suggest, that because these others are so obviously other and they're so vivid, well, then they could not possibly be the creation of my own mind. But every night in dreams, you create a compelling, or what is to you at the time, a totally compelling simulacrum of another person, right? And that just proves the mind is capable of doing it. Now, it's the phenomenon of lucid dreaming shows that the mind isn't capable of doing everything you think it might be capable of, even in that space. So,
but there's quite a lot of discussion about what it's like to do math on LSD, because apparently one of the deepest thinking processes needed is those of mathematicians or theoretical computer scientists. Basically, doing anything that involves math is proofs. And you have to think creatively, but also deeply. And you have to think for many hours at a time. And so they're always looking for ways to, like, is there any sparks of creativity that could be injected? And apparently, out of all the psychedelics, the worst is LSD, because it completely destroys your ability to do math well. And I wonder whether that has to do with your ability to visualize geometric things in a stable way in your mind and hold them there and stitch things together, which is often what's required for proofs. But again, it's difficult to kind of research these kinds of concepts, but it does make me wonder what are the spaces, how is the space of things you're able to think about and explore morphed by different psychedelics or dream states and so on, and how is that different? How much does it overlap with reality? And what is reality? Is there a waking state reality, or is it just a tiny subset of reality and we get to take a step in other versions of it? We tend to think very much in a space-time, four-dimensional. There's a three-dimensional world, there's time, and that's what we think about reality. And we think of traveling as walking from point A to point B in the three-dimensional world. But that's a very kind of human, surviving, trying not to get eaten by a lion conception of reality. What if traveling is something like we do with psychedelics and meet the elves? What if thinking, or the space of ideas as we kind of grow and think through ideas, that's traveling? Or what if memories is traveling?
What is good, what is bad? If you use it for recreation, you use it for an experience, to learn about yourself. It's like the line is very tiny. There's some countries that drugs are all legals. You know what I mean? And I don't know the stats, but I would be interesting to know if they have more crimes there than other countries where it's more strict. I would be interesting to know about that. It's fascinates me, I think in the future we'll look back and we'll think of ourselves being stupid to put people in jail instead of like trying to fix the problem in at the base. Of course now I guess it's our ignorance that made it in a way that we cannot sometimes understand what makes sometimes a psychopath or a murderer a murderer. But if we can pinpoint the problem and take care of it before, what I mean, or made it in a way that we can re-establish that person in the society, who knows, what was the future's hold. It's interesting. We live in an interesting time.
Sasha Shulgin, who sort of the godfather of MDMA, he sort of rediscovered it and brought it back into use. He talked about his first experience was with mescaline. His first psychedelic experience was with mescaline. and he had a tremendous experience. But what he said about it was he was having a human experience that the mescaline was helping him access, rather than that he was having a mescaline experience. So that it's not like you pop a pill and you always have the same kind of experience as everybody else. The experience is not contained in the pill. The pill opens you up and you have an experience of yourself. Sometimes these are experiences that we've never consciously had. But we can say right now that we know that our body, below the level of our conscious awareness, has all these self-healing mechanisms. And we don't modulate them to a large extent by conscious control. I mean, eventually we are learning more about the mind-body, and we learn about the placebo effect, how what we think is the case. But I think that there's experiences that are below our level of conscious awareness, particularly once we're adults, that are more these unitive mystical experiences, sense of connection. You know, I think kids are like this a lot. We kind of come from the void, you could say, and you're born and you have a different way of processing information.
You know, for those who don't know, DMT is often touted as the most intense psychedelic and also the shortest acting. I mean, you smoke it and it's basically a 10-minute experience, or a 3-minute experience within like a 10-minute window. That when you're really down after 10 minutes or so. And Terence McKenna was a big proponent of DMT. That was his, the center of the bullseye for him psychedelically, apparently. And it is characterized, it seems, for many people by this phenomenon, which is unlike virtually any other psychedelic experience, which is it's not just your perception being broadened or changed. It's you, according to Terence McKenna, feeling fairly unchanged, but catapulted into a different circumstance. You have been shot elsewhere, and find yourself in relationship to other entities of some kind. Right? So the place is populated with things that seem not to be your mind.
So it does feel like travel to another place because you're unchanged yourself.
Again, I just have this on the authority of the people who have described their experience, but it sounds like it's pretty common. It sounds like it's pretty common for people not to have the full experience because it's apparently pretty unpleasant to smoke. So it's like getting enough on board in order to get shot out of the cannon and land among the what McKenna called self-transforming machine elves. Yeah. That appeared to him like jeweled, Fabergé egg-like self-dribbling basketballs that were handing him completely uninterpretable reams of profound knowledge.
Well, as far as I know, psilocybin, so mushrooms, magic mushrooms, as far as I know, in terms of the studies they're running, I think have they're allowed to do what they're calling heroic doses. So that one does not have a toxicity. So they could do like huge doses in a clinical setting when they're doing study on psilocybin, which is kind of fun.
I remember the first time I did a big dose of mushrooms and I was looking at a tree for a long time and I was just crying with overwhelm at how beautiful the tree was. And it was a tree outside the front of my house that I'd walked by a million times and never looked at like this. And it wasn't the dose of mushrooms where I was hallucinating like where the tree was purple. Yeah. Like the tree still looked like, if I had to describe it, I'd say it's green and it has leaves, looks like this. But it was way fucking more beautiful, like capturing than it normally was. And I'm like, why is it so beautiful if I would describe it the same way? And I realized I had no thoughts taking me anywhere else. Yeah. Like what it seemed like the mushrooms were doing was just actually shutting the narrative off that would have me be distracted so I could really see the tree. And then I'm like, fuck, when I get off these mushrooms, I'm going to practice seeing the tree because it's always that beautiful and I just miss it. And so I practice being with it and quieting the rest of the mind and then being like, wow. And if it's not mushrooms, like people have peak experiences where they'll see life and how incredible it is. It's always there.
By and large, skeptically, I have to say, psychedelics have not really taught us anything about the nature of consciousness. I'm hopeful that they will. They have been used around certain, I don't even know if features is the right term, but things that are called consciousness. So consciousness can refer to not only just phenomenal consciousness, which is like, the source of the hard problem and
Yep.
what it is to be like Nagel's description. But the sense of self, which can be sort of like the experiential self, moment to moment, or it can be like the narrative self, the stringing together of stories. So those are things that I think can be, and a little bit's been done with psychedelics regarding that, but I think there's far more potential. So like one story that unfolded is that psychedelics acutely have effects on the default mode network, a pattern of activation amongst a subset of brain areas that is associated with self-referential processing. It seems to be more active, more communication between these areas, like the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, for example, being parts of this that are, and others that are tied with sort of thinking about yourself, remembering yourself in the past, projecting yourself into the future. And so that it's an interesting story emerged when it was found that when psilocybin is on board, in the person's system, that there's less communication amongst these areas. So with resting state fMRI imaging, that there's less synchronization or presumably communication between these areas. And so I think has been overstated in terms of, we see this is the dissolving of the ego. This is it. The story made a whole lot of sense, but there's several. I think that story is really being challenged. Like one, we see increasing number of drugs that decouple that network, including ones like that aren't psychedelic. So this may just be a property, frankly, of being like, screwed up. Being out of your head, being like.
Anytime you mess with the perception system, maybe it screws up some just our ability to just function in the holistically like we do in order, for the brain to perceive stuff, to be able to map it to memory, to connect things together, the whole recur mechanism that could just be messed with
right.
drugs.
I would just point out that our minds are clearly capable of producing apparent others on demand that are totally compelling to us, right? There's no limit to our ability to do that, as anyone who's ever remembered a dream can attest. I mean, every night we go to sleep, some of us don't remember dreams very often, but some dream vividly every night. And just think of how insane that experience is. I mean, you've forgotten where you were, right? That's the strangest part. I mean, this is psychosis, right? You have lost your mind. You have lost your connection to your episodic memory, or even your expectations that reality won't undergo wholesale changes a moment after you have closed your eyes, right? Like you're in bed, you're watching something on Netflix, you're waiting to fall asleep, and then the next thing that happens to you is impossible, and you're not surprised, right? You're talking to dead people, you're hanging out with famous people, you're someplace you couldn't physically be, you can fly, and even that's not surprising, right? So you have lost your mind, but relevantly for this,
or found it.
You found something. I mean, lucid dreaming is very interesting because then you can have the best of both circumstances, and it's then it can be kind of systematically explored.
Mm-hmm. One of the first neuroscience books I ever read was about hallucinations and how psychedelics and dreaming are very similar. That was way back when I was in high school. I was just curious, and he really understood the relationship between LSD and REM dreams and how similar they are. I think psychedelics, and Matt knows way more about this than I do, of course, but psychedelics have some very interesting properties. They are certainly not for everybody, right? And kids, it's a problem. I think the major issues right now around the psychedelic conversation is that it's clear that they can unveil certain elements of neuroplasticity. They make the brain amenable to change, changing up space-time relationships, changing up the emotional load of an event and being able to reframe that. It's clear that happens. But there's two major issues. One is that people talk about plasticity as if plasticity is the goal. But plasticity is a state within which you can direct neurology. And the question is, what changes are you trying to get to? So people are just taking psychedelics to unveil plasticity. Mm-hmm. without thinking about what circuits they want to modify and how, I think that's a problem. I think there's great potential, however, for people opening up these states of plasticity with psychedelics or otherwise, and directing the plastic changes toward a particular endpoint.
There's no doubt that things like psilocybin, MDMA are useful for things like anxiety, depression, end-of-life distress, PTSD, alcoholism, you name it. And it's largely because of the clinical research that MDMA and psilocybin will probably be legal in some FDA-regulated way in the next 5 years. But I mean, again, I start the first page of my book with this question: why do psychedelics work across all these different conditions? And the best that I could find is the meaning, right? Tony Bossis at NYU talks about psilocybin, for example, as meaning-making medicine, which is interesting because it puts it somewhere between a therapeutic and, again, this ontological instigator. What is it about psychedelics that creates these mystical experiences or mystical-like experiences? You can call them emotional breakthroughs. You can call them moments of awe. I do think we get locked up in the language, and we're somewhere between science and religion here, including legally. So the FDA is one route to this. What excites me about psychedelics is the First Amendment. What is this going to mean for religion? The freedom of religion being the first thing that's mentioned in the First Amendment before freedom of speech, freedom of assembly.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
If America is known for anything, it's a refuge for religious pioneers. And so we already have the Native American church, Brazilian-spawned churches that are using psychedelics. But what would happen if Judaism or Christianity or Islam were to begin incorporating the very ritual, very sacred, and discreet use of psychedelics as part of their liturgy? Psychedelics seem to be particularly fast-acting, particularly potent, and very reliable, especially in the clinical studies. And so I looked at them as biochemical discoveries, like Huxley did. Maybe it's once in your life, or infrequently, right? But maybe that's the beginning of a genuine introspection and a life well examined, as the ancients always instructed us.
If we take this brilliant idea that language constrains us, grounds us, language and other things of the waking world ground us, maybe it is that you've found the full capacity of your cognition when you dream or when you do psychedelics. You're stepping outside the little human cage, the cage of the human condition. Open the door and step out and look around and then go back in.